Good morning, everyone. We want to go ahead and get started in that we're 4 minutes late. So what we can afford to do is get some of my introduction down. For those of you who are streaming, welcome. We're glad you're here. If anybody's visiting with us, we have welcome bags out in the reception area, and we are very happy to have you take one and learn more about All Saints Church and continue to return. No doubt more people will be flowing in, but let's get started. I believe in the Holy Spirit and her timing. Recently, Gene Robinson was with us, and Gene said, All Saints Church needs to know about the T in LGBT. All Saints is known as being radically inclusive for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. And my hunch is that All Saints doesn't have much experience with what that T stands for. And as the Spirit would have it, soon after, I learned about our speaker this morning and what was going on with him at APU. Our speaker is, until recently, a full professor of theology in the Department of Philosophy and Theology at Azusa Pacific University. He's an ordained minister in the Church of the Brethren. Dr. Ackley was removed from his teaching post after being outed as a transgender male. He has written, this year has been a transition from being a mentally ill woman to being a sane transgendered man. We have much to learn from Adam Ackely, and I would love for you to give him a very warm All Saints greeting.
Oh, well, I'm just glad that my dismissal from the university came in a timely fashion for All Saints. But I also need to correct that I wasn't outed. That was something, in my emotional state at the time, that was something I said one time and kind of it blew up. Things spread around the internet. So I felt that way. But what happened actually, I can't say too much about that, but I shared my impending name change with the supervisor, and we tried to figure out ways to manage what that implied to the community who knew me as Heather. And it didn't go well. Within 24 hours, I was asked to leave. But the reason that I sort of felt that I'd been outed was that my initial thought was to be very tender and gentle with this community I'd been part of for 15 years. And understanding that they didn't know much about transgender, as far as I was aware. They have a positional statement that clearly demonstrates they're uncomfortable with issues of sexual diversity. So I didn't think this community was going to be comfortable with having me announce that I was transgender, and I tried to manage that slowly and carefully. And I see a dear friend walking in that I'm so happy to see. Don Dayton. Anyway, okay, so I was asked to come talk with you today specifically about being transgender and Christian. So you may or may not know about people who are transgender. I think there are a lot of misunderstandings even today about what transgender means. I know the most common misunderstanding that people keep asking me about, particularly people, I spent a day Friday with a sophomore from Biola University who I can go into a long story, but anyway, she wanted to get the scoop on what really happened and shared a very common thing that I've heard over and over again, that the perception that I changed from being a woman and that I've changed into being a man. So one thing I would say to you about being transgender, if you don't understand this, is probably the most important thing to understand about it, is that you're not changing from something that you once were to something that you can never be. But certainly in my experience at least, and I don't speak for all transgender people, we have diverse experiences like any other group, But it is pretty common amongst my transgender brothers and sisters to say that we've always felt differently gendered, that we, one of the terms that's often used for the 99% of folks that identify with their birth gender is cisgendered or gender conforming. 99% of people, that's how it is. If you were identified as a little boy at birth, you feel like a guy. If you're identified as a little girl at birth, you feel like a girl. Transgendered people usually feel some sense of experiencing both or some sort of dissonance with the birth gender, and then we express that in so many varieties of ways. But my point being, if one is transgender, one has pretty much always been transgender. It's sort of a gender variation. There are 6 or 7 different gender markers. There's the one that we see on little babies when they're born, but there's also brain structure, there's chromosomal and genetic markers, there's of various kinds. There's the internal structure, of course. There's hormones in the endocrine system that produces the hormones. So there's a lot of different things. And in transgender people, usually what happens is that instead of all 7 of those things being in the same category of gender, we experience maybe some of those being in one gender and some in another gender. And so we have a kind of a diverse, that's only 1% of people, but that's what we experience. So if you're transgender, you've pretty much always been transgender. And we navigate that, we each navigate that differently, being that gender minority, that 1%. It's very challenging, it's very confusing. You're not born with a roadmap for how to be a transgender person, and if you're born into a community of faith, you really don't necessarily know how to navigate that. So my way of navigating it was trying to live as a female, because that was my birth gender. And but I was always transgender, and I could go into more detail about that, but I probably won't right now. You can ask me questions about it if you want to, but I always thought I was going to grow up to be a man. And a lot of transgender kids are like that. They know how people see them as in a certain gender as a child, but they feel pretty androgynous, and it comes as a big shock for many of us at puberty when we start developing into the gender we didn't identify with. So as a little kid, I thought I was going to grow up and be a guy, and stuff happens at 12. Where did these come from? Why are they here? That's a very common transgender experience. So it's very disorienting, and so what happens is that then people who are transgender often will seek some kind of counseling or support for those feelings of disorientation. It used to be called gender identity disorder. It's now called just gender dysphoria. It's not a mental illness, it's just a name for that feeling of people see me one way, I'm told I'm this thing, but I don't feel that. That just doesn't match up with how I understand myself. It's dysphoric, it's a disconnect. And how do we navigate that socially? So we all have different ways of doing that. So my way was to throw myself into spiritual seeking. And I've always been a very spiritual person. So I was raised with hippie parents, which was great. And so, Free to Be You and Me, if any of you remember the old Ms. magazine. Yeah, Free to Be You and Me, Marlo Thomas and all that. Right, so that was good for me as a little transgender kid. Yay, okay, so I am free to... That probably laid the groundwork that I can grow up and be the free adult that I get to live as today. But anyway, so my parents didn't impose a lot of gender stuff on me, but through my spiritual seeking, I studied all the religions of the world that I could get their scriptures in my home library or at the public library. I just studied and studied. I assumed that Christianity would not be one of the ones I would be looking at because my parents had been raised Christian and had horrible things to say about Christian hypocrisy as hippies. In fact, my dad was at Kent State the day of the shootings. So that's the kind of family I come from, that kind of mindset of, but anyway, sort of question everything. And so I looked elsewhere, but I actually ended up Christian. In my search of world scriptures, I read the Hebrew scriptures first before I looked at the Christian ones. And I remember reading the prophets at that time when my body was changing and I was not turning into a man. And I was very distressed, as many transgender teenagers are. I was suicidally depressed, as many transgender teenagers are. And in fact, I would share with you, transgender people who don't get help, the suicide rate, according to the Centers for Disease Control, among transgender people is the highest of any group. It's about 4 times higher than the next highest group. So about 47% of us attempt suicide. So, and I was in that 47%. I mean, your chances are good if you're talking to a transgender person. You have about half and half chance that person's attempted suicide at some point. So I say that to you as Christians because I would hope that as Christians we would be very compassionate with this really hurting group of folks. But in any case, in my own despair, I read the Hebrew prophets, and many of the Hebrew prophets and the Psalms of Lament also echo a sentiment of, why did you make me? I would have better been dead in my mother's womb than born like this. And I found out by reading that, I started crying. I remember reading that, I think it was in Ezra the first time I read that. It recurs through many of the prophets and Psalms. But I started crying, and I thought, you can talk to God like that? Because that's exactly how I feel. Why was I born this way? I would have been better off not being born at all than to be born transgender. So that actually gave me faith. I mean, that sounds very depressing, but it gave me faith because I thought there is a God who understands and affirms this experience as holy enough to put it in sacred scriptures, holy enough that we read it today, thousands of years later, and we proclaim it and we celebrate it as a community, as a sacred experience. I kept reading and got to the Gospel of Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount, and encountered a Jesus. I grew up very poor. Another thing about my parents, not only were they hippies, which means they were countercultural, of course, they also struggled with addictions. So because of that, we grew up in very uncertain, financial, precarious times, lean times. And so when I was reading the Gospel of Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount, about this Jesus, I didn't know like incarnation theology at this point. I just read his teachings about feeding the poor, the importance of feeding the poor, Matthew 25, that this is a person that clearly the Christian community worships in some way as God or as a very important signifier of God or avatar of God. And so I thought, if Christians understand how important it is to feed the hungry the way this book is telling me they understand it, then this is where I want to be. I want to be with these people. This is, it's the Hebrew God to whom I can cry and lament and complain and thinks it's holy, and it's coupled with a community that feeds the poor. This is my place. So I became a Christian at 18. Now the difficulty with that was that I went from being that free to be you and me child raised by feminist hippie parents to entering a religion now that had different messages about gender than the ones I'd grown up with. And when I was 7, Renee Richards, the tennis star, had her very famous surgeries, her gender reassignment, and was pretty much, as I saw it, celebrated in the media as a successful person who was living her life as herself. This is a transgender tennis star. So when I was 7, that broke in the news, and I thought, great, there's a treatment. I can do this. Even though I felt like a guy, I just thought the same thing, right? It's the same thing. So I grew up from the time I had heard of Renee Richards thinking, I will get this surgery. When I'm 18, I will still get to grow up and be a man at some point. But at 18, instead of starting transgender treatment, female to male, I became a Christian. And I kind of took the opposite tack. I thought, this is not welcome in this community. I'm a lover of men. That thing has never budged. I've always been attracted to other males. So that was another thing. It's like, well, I could live in Christian community where they think I'm a woman and I could have a husband. But I don't see any other transgender Christians. And it's pretty clear to me, this was in the early 80s, I will not have a mate if I come out as a guy. So I decided, all right, I want to follow Jesus. I guess that means I have to live as a straight woman. And I put 30 years into that. 30 years. I sought many treatments, many forms of psychiatric medications, pretty much every form of psychiatric medication to treat what that did to me. I was suicidal the whole time, on and off. I was also treated with female hormones because I'm naturally androgynous and I'm not gender conforming, not medically, not in any way am I gender conforming. So doctors gave me female hormones to feminize me. And it just made it worse. It was like going through puberty all over again as a transgender person, deep despair. So I'm telling you all this because I got the understanding that you wanted to understand a little bit more about just being transgender. So that's one transgender story to kind of put to the T. This is kind of what the journey can be like. What changed for me, and that's what I really want to focus on as a Christian, is that for 30 years I thought by praying to this Christian God, understood that I could speak the language of lament, and I did. And the thorn in the flesh language, take this thing away, why haven't you taken it away yet? Okay, you want me to live with it longer, but still, turn me into a woman at some point, if that's what your church tells me I have to be. There was a lot of, I always used to compare myself to Jacob. I said, I'm wrestling with God all the time. That's how I pray. Me and God, we wrestle. And I come out wounded. But I finally came out with a new name. Okay, that's a Jacob story. Okay, anyway, Jacob, Israel. Okay, all right. Anyways, so for 30 years I wrestled with God. I thought that was what my spiritual life was always going to be. But in January of this year, as I told you, I was treated with all these different medications. They called all kind of complications. I continued to be suicidal since the psychiatric medications didn't work to ease the depression and the anxiety and the moods. I started drinking and self-medicating, primarily with alcohol. The things I was taking weren't supposed to be mixed with alcohol, so that certainly, I was in full-blown addiction pretty quick. And I got very sick. I was nearly dying. I had pancreas failure last year. I had kidney failure that was resistant to all treatment. There was nothing else to do but to stop all that, to stop everything, and to start over again with a new care team. So in January, thinking that I was going to die because we had spent 18 months of watching me spiral downward and no doctor being able to help me as a woman, I finally started with this new care team. They did the usual intake that new doctors, new psychiatrists, new psychologists do. And as always, I brought up my gender identity issues in the first session. And this time, I wasn't told, that's not important. We're not going to talk about that. That's not your issue. I was told, oh, that sounds important. Let's talk about that. So, as of January, I had a psychiatrist within weeks telling me, you don't need any psychiatric medications. You are not depressed. You are not anxious. You certainly don't have mood swings. You're just transgender. Stop fighting it. Okay. A psychologist, you're a guy. Why don't you just, you want to live as a guy? Yes, I want to live as a guy. Why don't you try living as a guy? Maybe you're upset because you're wearing dresses and lipstick all the time and you don't like that. It's true, I don't like it. Okay. So my psychologist accepted me as a transgender guy. My psychiatrist I stopped seeing because we didn't have any work to do together. I wasn't on pills. My doctor, I started to thrive, gain weight. I don't have any medical problems, healthy as a horse, as a matter of fact. So things progressed. I regained the weight I'd lost, and I'm healthy. I went back to college to teach after a sabbatical, healthy, strong, happy, at peace, not mentally ill anymore, not moody, not depressed, not distracted by trying to hide the secret, fully present to my students as I'm now fully present to my children who, by the way, people always ask me, aren't your children traumatized? Their mom turned into their dad? No. Okay, their mom didn't turn into their dad. I'm still their mom. They still call me mommy. I did give birth to them. I carried them. I birthed them. I nursed them. They're my children. And that's part of my life as a transgender person. I've had experiences in both genders. And I know 99% of people don't do that, but I did. And that's okay. We don't have to get alarmed about it, I don't think. My children aren't alarmed about it. They're just happy their parent is healthy and plays with them and helps them with their homework and goes to school functions, because I can do that now because I'm not dying. So likewise, I came back to my students, and I was just thrilled to be with them. We were having great times in the classroom, I believe, and I get that feedback from them. But I did need to let my employer know what was going on, in that I wasn't using a first name anymore. I was asking people to call me by initials, because Heather, being a guy, I mean, it's a nice name. Thank you, Mom and Dad, Heather. But they thought I was a girl, and Heather is in the guy's name. And so I'm Heath, and instead of Anne, which was my grandmother's name, I kept the A. But Adam, from Ha-Adam in Genesis, the person made of earth, the human being that isn't divided into genders until verse 22 of chapter 2. So Ha-Adam, that's, of course I went to the Bible, because that's what I've always done. I went to the Bible, and I thought, where is there a person like me? Maybe I can stop being Jacob. I stopped being Jacob. I don't wrestle with God anymore. One of the spiritual changes in my life actually happened way back in January. So this, to me, is not a change about me changing from a woman to a man. This is a change from wrestling with God like Jacob to surrendering. Because the spiritual advice I got from my spiritual directors in my spiritual recovery programs to stay clean and sober was stop fighting God, learn to give God thanks for who you are. Even if you are transgender, even if you are a guy, even though that's going to be very hard, learn to give God thanks for that, because if you don't give God thanks for what you really are, you are not going to stay sober. So this is why I threw myself hard into learning to be a transgender guy and be glad for it at all costs. Because indeed, I believe it. I will drink again. You know, if I don't face this, if I live in fear, I will drink. I will hurt myself. When I drink, I get suicidal. And I think in my journey at this point, after 30 years of that, it's a pretty dangerous thing for me to play around with. So when I came back and had to tell my employer, you know, I'm not using the name Heather anymore. I haven't done anything else yet, but I just need you to know I'm not using that name. It became something that soon was not within, I think it was within 24 hours of us talking about it privately, just with me and a supportive supervisor who studies intersex issues and understands this stuff. But we tried to figure out how to manage this together with that whole wider community, and it just turned into a media firestorm, as some of you may have become aware. So here's what I had to do. Well, how do I surrender to God in this? Now I'm being taken away from my students with whom I'm having better prayer life and better teaching and better everything than ever. And I'm about to lose a job and all that entails, health benefits, a way to pay rent, mortgage, whatever, all those things, okay, all those goodies. My marriage was breaking up for other reasons. It was a marriage I'd entered into in addiction, and it was a very sick marriage based on my own false identity and also some falseness on the other person's part. It was an abusive marriage. So again, that was a thing that needed to come to an end, but there was a lot of loss going on at the same time. So spiritually, it's how do I surrender to this? How do I surrender to this? How do I do God's will in this? How do I stay sober with all this loss going on in my life? And how do I witness to Christ when misrepresentation of what it means to be transgender, that thing about, oh, she is a crazy woman who's trying to be a man now, that was the story that went out over the media. And I said, it really, I would cry because I thought, at that point I had had no medical intervention. All I did was stop taking female hormones. And I tried to talk to people, and I say, you know, if anything, now I'm not trying to change who I am. Because I was trying to change into a woman before. I was trying to live as a cisgendered straight woman. And I can never be that thing. I mean, I really tried. I tried to death. And people saw that. I was down to 112 pounds, like almost 30 pounds thinner than I am today, 25 pounds thinner than I am right now. And I'm not really a big person. So I was very frail. And people saw that, and they knew I was dying. But still, this community decided that the kind of the message I got is better off you would have died as a woman than to live as a gay man. I mean, I've already said those words, but I'm saying that's how I felt about it, all right? And I'm not saying anybody said those words exactly, although there was a lot of hate mail, and there still is. People who try to convert me from a Christian standpoint. One of the things about this is that because I chose to use this, or not chose to use this, that's not the right language. I've tried to be faithful as a Christian as I've navigated the public attention here. I've tried to witness Christ in this situation. I've tried to educate people on what it means to be transgender, but I've also tried to do that as a Christian. And so in other words, I've tried to turn the other cheek. I have tried not to be kind. I've tried to, as we say in spiritual recovery, carry the message, practice the principles of spirituality in everything that I do and say. And I know, again, it's a little selfish because I know who I am living as sane, sober, and serene depends on me doing this right for my own sake. On the other hand, it has helped shine a light for a lot of other people. I've had people from all over the world, literally, and I'm not kidding, every continent but Antarctica, people who are transgender from all over the world contact me and say, I did not know I could be Christian. People who are suicidal, yeah, it's a big thing. It's a big thing. Now, God has used it. What I said to the girl from Biola the other day is, I think of it like Genesis, where Joseph says to his brothers, what you intended for evil, God's used for good. And that's really happened. That's really happened. People who were suicidal because they thought just by being themselves, they were going to go to hell. I actually spent transgender. Susan asked me to talk a little bit about Transgender Day of Remembrance Wednesday. I was at a vigil that was the first vigil Occidental College ever held for Transgender Day of Remembrance, which is an annual celebration of the people murdered in the past year just in hate crimes because they're transgender. This is the group. Transgender people get murdered at a rate higher than all other groups targeted for hate crimes put together. That comes from the FBI and the Department of Justice. And that's been true for years, every year. It's still true as of 2012, most recent year for statistics. So it's a big thing. Transgender people get murdered in hate crimes more than anybody else by far. So we commemorate that once a year around the world. It's an international vigil. I put a lot in Huffington Post on that, trying to resource people who aren't familiar with it on it. But anyway, so this community decided that they were going to celebrate it for the first time, and my spiritual mentor came. He's also a trans man who's post-surgery. He transitioned over a decade ago. He's married to a transgender woman. But anyway, he came up to support me at this vigil, because I was leading it. I was speaking at the same time frame as today. And it was my first time at a Transgender Day of Remembrance vigil, and here I was the speaker. I thought, I'm really in deep water here. I'm a fish out of water. So he came to support me. Anyway, at the end, he closed the vigil unexpectedly. He shared a few closing words that it hadn't been planned, but he said, this is the first time I've ever seen in all my years of being at Transgender Day of Remembrance vigils, and he's been doing that for about 20 years. He said, it's the first time I've ever seen allies, not transgender people, but allies organize one. And it's the only time I've ever seen a Transgender Day of Remembrance vigil where the allies outnumbered the trans folks. Okay, so this is the kind of thing, again, like the people contacting me who thought I'm going to hell because I'm transgender, or there's no place in the church for me because I'm transgender. It's the same thing. The allies doing things. My mentor was very moved because he said, this really is healing for me as a trans man, because usually I get the impression that people who are not transgender don't care about us. So for allies to organize a vigil and then attend it and support it and invite one of us to speak at it and be in solidarity with us to that degree, he said, this is huge. This is a huge event. That's a way to stand with transgender people as people of faith. This was an interfaith gathering, but again, I just share that from the standpoint of how faith and transgender intersect. The other thing I was going to say leading into that was actually that on the way there, I got a phone call. This happens to me all the time now. People use I have a public Facebook page, public LinkedIn page, Twitter, not because I'm trying to promote myself, but because this is what's happening, because people are reaching out to me. They've heard this story, and transgender people all over the world are like, how do I find out more about this? I can really stay in my faith. I can really transition and not go to hell. So I got one of those phone calls driving down to Occidental. A young man who was crying, was about to commit suicide. No kidding. It was one of my former students' friends, and thank God my former student, having had my contact information, just called me and said, he's going to kill himself, can he call you? Yes. And I gave her all the stuff, have him look at the stuff online. He knows who I am now. So he called, and with my recovery partner there in the car with me, who's transgender, and just poured his heart out. Anyway, his thing was, look, I'm transgender and I love women, but I feel like a guy, but all around me, my family and my church is telling me I'm going to go to hell. And my partner thinks she's going to go to hell too. And that's why he wanted to kill himself. All right, so I ended up spending about 3 days mentoring that person. And then I got, anyway, that's just one example, but that's how I spent the Transgender Day of Remembrance. Helping prevent one more person being named on that list that very same night. And that's what I get to do. Yeah.
That was really wonderful. I kept expecting you to go on and on and on because there was some more.
I could, but I won't.
I told him I expected him to keep going on and on, so I was caught kind of, and he said he could go on and on.
Yeah.
And since, pardon?
No, go ahead.
So, but since we have this moment, a lot of juice starts flowing when we have questions. So raise your hands. We've got microphones that can come to you. There's one over here. Oh, great. Right over here, please, and one down here. Okay, if y'all can leap down there, that'd be great. We ask that you wait until a microphone comes since we're streaming this. So, first question, thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your story. Amazing. And obviously, it seems to me once you become yourself and you're honest with who you are, you can do amazing works through God. Yeah. But the question I have for you is you said your kids see you as their mom. How about students, people who you are a mentor to, who had you as a female professor and who now will know you as a male? If they're speaking about you past tense, for us here at a church who want to embrace the T, what is the appropriate way to refer to you past tense in your opinion? Is it she or he?
Oh, that's a really good question. Okay, so let me just say this, because one of the first things I tried to explain was that those of us who are transgender experience it very, very differently. And so what we usually teach allies is please just ask each individual what they prefer. In my case, I'm very understanding that I've transitioned much later in life than most people do. So I try to be understanding that if you knew me as Heather, whatever, okay, I understand. I would like those who want to stay in my life to understand that I was always me inside. I was a person living with a secret that I was trying to fix, that couldn't be fixed. I was trying to fix myself from a transgender guy into this cisgendered female that I can't be, and I never really was. So that was a person, if you knew that person, you saw a person that was really struggling, that was depressed a lot of the time, that was sick a lot of the time. Honestly, my experience with my students has been they've all embraced, immediately, they embraced calling me Adam and he. And I have students over at my house, literally still from APU. They come over every Friday night. They have dinner at my house. We call it Shabbat. Because I was trying to teach them the practice of taking a day of rest. You know how undergraduate students are. They don't rest. They have jobs and boyfriends and girlfriends and some schoolwork in there somewhere and social networking. And so, yeah, they come over to my house. We light candles. We pray. We eat. We laugh. We play. My little 6-year-old leads them in hopscotch. It's very silly and it's very fun and it's very wholesome and yeah, but they took right away to Adam. There's very few people that didn't take to it right away. In fact, I had two. This I really want to share. This was very affirming to me. It just happened in the last couple weeks. Two of my best friends from junior high school, when I was in 6th grade, when I was going through that transition of puberty, like the wrong puberty. So two of those young women contacted me out of the blue and said, we've been following your story and we want to know, we still want to be your friend. We still love you. We think this makes sense for you. And we're so glad that you finally did this. They've known me since I was 12. So and again, I would say the same thing, except for two people in my huge extended Appalachian family. If you know Appalachian families, I'm buddies with my 5th cousins and stuff. We're like cousins and cousins and cousins. There's not anybody. There's two people who didn't like jump right on this and say, of course, what took you so long, So it's been very affirming.
Before the next question, let me pose something, ask you to respond to it, Adam, that I think is related to that question. I remember a kind of a turning point in my life about transgender people when I said, and several people were around, I don't know if that person is a male or a female. And the response of this very wise friend said, very lovingly, I would invite you to liberate yourself from having to classify everybody as male or female. Now that was a light bulb. Mm-hmm. And then in preparing for your visit, I was doing some Googling about you, and a YouTube speech by Lana Wachowski came up, and she and her brother wrote the Matrix movie, and she's always been trans and made this very eloquent speak at the Human Rights Award for the Courage Award. And she said a phrase that helped me also, which reinforced what my friend had said, that the world needs to move beyond what she called a binary gender narrative. Mm-hmm. And we talk here a lot about both andness, mm-hmm. being so much more mature and Christ-like mm-hmm. than either or mentality. So could you just address that part of your life?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a big thing in transgender community too. We talk about moving beyond the gender binary. So there's a lot of aspects of gender. There's your gender identity, in my case transgender, that's kind of for me, and again, like I can't say it enough, across the transgender spectrum, there are people at various places on that spectrum. For me, I'm more of a both and kind of person, a guy who's a mom. And okay, that's how it is. And I love guys, but as a guy. But so it's kind of a both and kind of experience. I've explained it sometimes as I feel like I was always a yin-yang person and still am. And in my practice today, I'm getting certified to become a yoga instructor because I've done yoga since I was 6, and I'd like to be able to teach it since I'm not going to probably be teaching Christian theology. But anyways, so I think I get to really be open about my yin-yang thing now. But so I feel like I was forced to live the yin only for many, many years, and that was, as people who knew me sometimes said, it was like you were less than half yourself. I just couldn't do that. It was very damaging. I was cutting myself in half. So I think a lot of us who are trans, and I think this is a reason that even though we're only 1%, this is something for everybody that's a gift that we can share, is that for all of us it's a gift to move into our both andness. Because we've all got that yin-yang thing going on. And some of us more so than others, some of us in different ways than others, but yes, absolutely. This is a very central piece of the message, and it's why I wanted to choose the name Ha-Adam, that reinforces the common humanity that every transgender person shares with every other person. I feel like the public discourse focuses only on our 1%-ness, and I don't think that's a really important piece. I don't experience that to be the most important piece. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Last question.
You touched on it a bit already. I was going to ask, the whole word trans means change. I'm looking at my brother in Christ who has not changed. He has come home. And so I wonder if we should rethink the whole trans, trans, because trans means change. These people are not changing. They're just coming home.
Yay. I think a lot of trans people would affirm that. You know, trans used to be transsexual in 1966. Harry Benjamin, a doctor who taught a lot of worked with a lot of trans patients, hundreds of them from Europe and North America, wrote this book, The Transsexual Phenomenon. He coined that phrase. If you read it's free, PDF is free online. You're not cutting into the Benjamin estate or anything. They've put it out there for people to look. Anyway, if you ever read it, if you ever had reason to, you'd find out that in coining that phrase, he said, I don't think this is the right term. I don't think we're going to land here, but I can't figure out what else to call this right now. So I think we have permission to play with this language. I think there's a reason to do it. The other thing I want to share about that from trans community, though, is that some people who are comfortable with still claiming and living into that phrase point out that trans doesn't only mean change, but it also means beyond. It means beyond. So many people who own a trans identity are thinking, I'm beyond the gender binary. I'm beyond defining myself in terms of gender, and certainly in terms of birth gender. So there's a way it can work, but I think the 99% that aren't part of that dialogue every day see it. I know I've experienced, really see it as the change that it isn't, and that's causing a lot of misunderstandings and pain. I'm not the only person that's lost their job, and yay ENDA, by the way, yay ENDA. So I'm not the only person that's had employment difficulties as a transgender person because of this confusion. So I appreciate that.
Adam Ackely, thank you very much. I'm sorry, I'm digging that.